Welcome to the Human Exceptionality discussion lecture. This is for the course Exceptional Child in the Classroom, and these are my notes and lecture over Chapter 1. We're going to start by focusing on the definition of exactly what does it mean when we talk about someone having a disorder. A disorder is a disturbance in normal functioning, mental, physical, and psychological. People who are considered to have a disorder could have one or they could have all three, the mental, physical, and psychological disorders. When we think about a person who has a disability, we think of that in terms of a condition resulting from a loss of physical functioning, or we think about it as difficulties in learning and social adjustment that significantly interferes with normal growth and development. A limitation imposed on a person by the environment and the person's capacity to cope with that limitation is known as a handicap. And when you think about a handicap, those would be people that, because of the environment or because of that person's capacity to cope, they have a specific limitation that hinders them from functioning and coping appropriately. When we think about the exceptional person, this refers to an individual whose physical, mental, or behavioral performance deviates so substantially from the average that additional support is required to meet the individual's needs. An exceptional person could be an individual who is exceptionally lower on the spectrum based on the standard norm, the average, or it could also be a person who is on the higher range of that spectrum. Anything that causes the performance to deviate, whether it deviates downward or upward, anything that causes that behavior, that physical or that mental capacity to deviate, that person is considered to be an exceptional person. And we are required to meet the individual needs of each exceptional child in our classroom. When we think about gifts and talents, I know that you all are familiar with the course in school, especially in elementary school. The students can be pulled out to go to gifted and talented, also known as GT. The students who qualify for GT have specific gifts and talents. These are basically extraordinary abilities in one or more areas. And a child can be labeled gifted and talented even if he has one exceptional, extraordinary ability that the average student in the class doesn't have. Now, do all students have gifts and talents? You can decide for yourself, but in my perception, I tend to see that all students, regardless, have some kind of special, unique gift or talent that others may not have. That's just how I've always perceived my students. Learning disabilities is known as a condition in which one or more of the individual's basic psychological processes in understanding or learning language are deficient. So the learning disability hinders the child from processing and understanding and actually learning. There are also intellectual disabilities. These are the limitations characterized by the sub-average intellectual functioning with related limitations in two or more adaptive skills. Intellectual disabilities are typically manifested before the age 18. Approaches that are used to describe someone who differs substantially from the norm are the developmental approach, the cultural approach, and the self-labeling. In the developmental approach, this has to do with using statistics and milestones to characterize what is deemed as normal in regards to growth and development. The cultural approach is typically defined by what society values. Society sets the tone for what is considered appropriate. So this is our culture, this is our society's standards, and therefore everyone coming into our area must abide by our cultural standards. And someone who does not fit that mold, they've moved here from somewhere different, somewhere else that is different from our society standards, then we deem them as being different. People are considered different when they do something that is disapproved by the other members within that dominant culture. This can happen for students. I've seen this in my own family, and I've seen this in the school districts where I've taught. A student can move from the state of Arkansas from one town to another, and because that student comes into a new setting, and he's a little bit different because he did things differently, his other setting had different standards deemed by society. So when he comes into this social setting, he's not readily accepted because he's different. And when I talk about being different, I'm not talking about way out of this world different. He just does things a little bit different. He may speak a little differently, dress a little differently. And I'm even talking about moving from one part of the state of Arkansas to another part of the state of Arkansas, and things are very, very different from one place to another. And we as educators need to be aware of this as new students are moving into our classroom. We need to do everything we can to make that student feel welcome and accepted no matter what. And we also need to teach our students that same acceptance, and we need to teach our students to begin to understand people who do things differently, look differently, or behave differently than we do in this particular area. Self-labeling is a self-imposed label that does not typically agree with society's labels. A person does not see exactly what society sees. A person says, I'm not going to be dictated by what society says I have to do. They can become a self-labeled person in that they are not going to be what is expected of them. Some of the negative implications of labels have to do with promoting stereotyping, discrimination, and exclusion. Anyone who comes in who is different, they tend to be stereotyped, they tend to be discriminated against, and they tend to be excluded from the rest of the group. A person can be defined by their label rather than who they truly are based on their positive qualities. We need to educate the students in our classroom in that we all have positive qualities. It can also cause lower expectations and sell that person short. That person may have been a very thriving student, a very thriving person, and when they come into this area, they are stereotyped, they're discriminated against, and they are excluded. This brings down their self esteem, and when their self esteem is lowered, then they begin to reduce their own expectations, and then they begin to just not even try anymore. They want to hide, they want to blend in, and they want to hide who they truly are. The environment in which an individual is observed can influence the perceptions of that person. This environment deems these things important. You don't have these qualities, therefore, you are less important of a person. So, as a classroom teacher, we need to be well aware of this, and we need to do everything in our power to prevent these negative implications of labeling from occurring within our classrooms. Positive implications of labels. There are some reasons for labeling certain students. There are reasons that we need those labels. We need to be able, as an educator, to distinguish those who are eligible for services from those who are not eligible. If a student is eligible for a special service to help that student to become a better learner and a better academic student, then definitely we need that label so that we can do the necessary paperwork, and there's a lot of it, but so that we can do the necessary paperwork to get those special services for that student. It also helps the professionals to communicate effectively with one another. Now, let me say this at this point. As an educator, we need to communicate with our colleagues who also work with that student. We need to be able to communicate with the resource teachers. We need to be able to communicate with he goes to this teacher for science and this teacher for math, and I teach English. So we need to be able to work together using the labeling terminology to say he has this such and such disorder. Therefore, we need to work with this student and we need to implement this, this, and this. How is that working for you in your classroom? Do you have any help that I could use in my classroom? So that's how we can use these labels positively as colleagues, as educators, as professionals in our realm. Now, because we should be able to communicate with our colleagues on a professional level relating to the needs of individual
It's
students.
10:30.
Related to individual students, that does not give us the right nor the authority to go out and share that labeling information with anyone outside of those of us who actually work with that one student or those particular students. We are not allowed to even talk about this to another colleague. In specifics, we can say, in general, I have a student who has, do you have any help for me? But you're not allowed to share the name of that student unless you are in that particular community, that's a professional community of we all have this student and we're all working together to accommodate that student as best possible. But it is illegal for us to share that information outside of that community. We shouldn't also go home and talk about it to our family and friends. That's not the way we need to de-stress when we get home. And it also will help determine the degrees of need and help us set service priorities. There are some students that they are at the top priority because their needs are so extreme and so significant that we've got to get help for them immediately. And then once we get those secured, then we can move to the next group. Okay, their group was they have definite needs and they definitely need to be accommodated, but they were not as pressing as these. We had to take care of these first, get these standards and services put in place, and then we can move on. Okay, let's talk about sterilization. Basically, sterilization is the process of making an individual unable to reproduce. And yes, it is usually done surgically. It should be done surgically by the professionals. The process of sterilization, there are reasons that certain groups of people want to sterilize other groups of people. When we think about eugenics, the belief in the possibility of improving the human race by discouraging the reproduction of people having genetic defects or inheritable undesirable traits. Is it right that we look at certain kinds of people, and because they might have a genetic birth defect or they might carry an inheritable undesirable trait, do we really have the right to say, because you have this, you should not be allowed to reproduce and have a child of your own? I'm going to put that ball in your court and ask you to think about that for the time being. See what you can come up with regarding your perspective of that. Now let's look at ADA. What was the precursor to the Americans with Disability Act, also known as ADA? Well, this was the passage of Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. The Section 504 was signed in 1973, and it ensured that prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in federally assisted programs and activities will be activated. Okay, what that means is if a student in the school system has a certain disability or any disability, he will not be discriminated against. It is illegal to deny that child services just because he has a certain disability. It is up to the school system based on a 504 plan, and I know you've heard that terminology. Based on a 504 plan, it is up to us as educators and a school district to meet the needs of that student and accommodate that student so that he can rise above his disabilities and have effectual learning experiences. One of the areas of reform during President Kennedy's office was the institutional reform. Americans with Disabilities Act ended discrimination in the private sector employment of all public services, public accommodations, transportation, and telecommunications. Prior to this, persons with disabilities were discriminated against. They were deemed not as good as everyone else. They were deemed not valid and valuable citizens of the United States. And this not only is functional in the school system, the children, the students, K-12, are protected now as a result of Section 504, but also now all Americans in the United States with disabilities are now protected against discrimination. In employment, they have to have the same opportunity to be hired for jobs as does anyone else in society. They must be allowed to use all public services with handicap implementations put in place. Public accommodations, transportation. In the larger cities, you'll notice that there are, I've ridden the subway trains a lot when I've traveled, and these subways and these trains, they have handicapped seating. And it is illegal for someone to be sitting in a handicapped seating area if someone gets on the train or the subway that has a particular handicap that deems that seat. It is up to us to get up. There are certain sections, if you've ever been on a subway or a public transporting train, you know what I'm talking about. And there are seats that fold down, but it has railing around it. If someone in a wheelchair is not there and there are no other seats available, then yes, you have the right to sit in that seat. But if someone boards that train at the next stop and they are in a wheelchair, then you are required to get up and stand and hold the rail because you are perfectly physically able to do so. And then that's put those seats up, and then that person in the wheelchair can wheel in there, and he will have railing to hang on to lock his wheelchair in place and support him as the train is traveling. So because of the Americans with Disability Act, those people now are no longer discriminated against, but they are now protected, and they have certain accommodations in place in public services as well as transportation and even telecommunications. They have to be able to, if they can't hear, they have to be able to read so that they will know what's going on. The definition, ADA definition of disability, is having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a person in some major life activity, and it's also having experienced discrimination because of this physical or mental impairment. Major provisions of the ADA include employment, transportation, public accommodations, government facilities, as well as telecommunications. Reasonable accommodations have to do with normalcy. Normalcy is the absence of a biological problem. If you're in the normalcy stage, you don't have a biological problem. If you're in the pathological stage, you have altercations in the organism caused by a disease. So you could have had a disease that has left you pathologically in a state of condition requiring specific accommodations. Now let's think about nature versus nurture. There's a great deal of controversy concerning how much of a person's ability is related to the sociocultural influences, which is nurture, as opposed to the genetic factors of nature. Student raised in this home environment will never rise above his circumstances. This is where he will always be. Some people argue that is the case. I tend to believe that all students can excel and become whatever they want to be, regardless of their environment and their home circumstances and situations, even regardless of their disabilities. If they are willing to put forth the effort, they can rise above their circumstances. Now, that doesn't mean that a person who is in a wheelchair because they cannot walk, I'm not saying that if they put their mind to it, they can get up and walk. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they may remain in a wheelchair, but that doesn't mean that they have to function as less than a person or a human being for the rest of their life. They can have great intelligent capacities that enables them to go on and be great professionals of whatever they choose to be. I had a student many years ago that had cerebral palsy, and she could not walk. She was in a wheelchair, and when she was, I was her instructor in English in the 7th and 8th grade. And if we took a field trip, I remember pushing her wheelchair. And she had a brilliant mind. She was very intelligent. She just could not function as all the other students could. And I'm still in contact with her today. And they were not even thinking that she would live beyond high school, if that long. And she is still a productive, prominent person in society. She lives in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and she is very productive. She went on to earn a master's degree and is working and is doing great. So I firmly believe that anyone with a desire can rise above their circumstances and become an exceptional person in society. Psychology is the science of human and animal behavior. It is the study of the acts and the mental events that can be observed and evaluated. And the impact of the Olmsted decision was a violation of the ADA to discriminate against people with disabilities by providing services only in institutions. ADA says that is a violation because people with disabilities can receive services not only in an institution but also in the community-based setting. That means that people with disabilities can remain in their environment and receive services and function as a normal human being by receiving these services, as opposed to locking them away in an institution only. There were 3 people significant in making some changes. Willem Wundt came up with the principle of introspection, and William James included learning, motivation, and emotions as we study the behaviors and the mental capacities of people. And then John B. Watson shifted the focus of psychology from a conscious experience to the observable behavior and the mental events going on with people. Now let's talk about another term known as deviant. If a person is labeled as a deviant, that means that this person is unable to adapt to social rules or establish interpersonal relationships used by social service professionals. Now, the term deviant is used by social service professionals. The principles that determine who shall be labeled deviant have to do with the behavior that does not meet the societal, cultural, or group expectations. A person coming into a group who does not meet the behavioral expectations of that society, that culture, or that group can be labeled as a deviant. Social deviance is not necessarily an illness. I have seen senior high students come into a group and they act a great deal more immature than that particular group of students. They can be labeled a deviant because their behavior patterns are very silly, not mature by any means, and they don't quite fit into this group with their peers because of their behaviors. They are expected to act in a certain mature, responsible manner in this particular group setting, and they come in and cannot do that. That doesn't mean that they have an illness. It just means that they have a social deviance. They do not correlate socially with their group of peers in this group. The range of behaviors defined as normal or deviant is determined by each culture. Each culture sets their own standard for normalcy. The job of social service professionals is to provide information about social behavior, and this includes disability, in the context of society as a whole. There are certain neurotic disorders, and these can be a combination of anxieties, compulsions, obsessions, and phobias. Now, let's think about this for just a little bit. I, I bet if you're honest with yourself, there are times when you have some type of neurotic disorder. I know I do. There are times that I begin to worry and stress, and then I become very anxious over a particular issue or occurrence. Just because I might delve into a little bit of anxious feelings every so often, and I'm implementing a bit of neurotic disorder, doesn't mean that I remain in that state all the time. It usually comes after I've been under a great deal of stress and very little sleep, and then I can begin to be a little anxious. There are times also when I'm a little bit compulsive. I am a meticulous person. I expect and prefer things to be done in a certain way. I don't enforce that on everyone all the time, but I do it myself. I want my desk in this organized manner. I want this organized. Even my purse, everything is organized. And when my husband needs to get something, he learned a long time ago, don't just go get something out of her purse and then put it back. Ask her first, because if it's out of place in my purse, it frustrates me. Phobias. I also have a phobia. I do not like mice, and I have a phobia, and I do not want to work through what it takes to overcome that phobia. Now, I can work through my anxieties and my compulsions. I can go out if I'm feeling very stressed and anxious. I can go for a run or a bicycle ride, and that will alleviate my stress. For that time being, and I have learned of ways to work with that, but I'm not willing to do what it takes to lock myself in a room with a mouse till I get over my fear of mice. That is a phobia that I'm okay to have. But when we think about the psychotic disorders, now the neurotic disorders, those can come and go, and they're not that serious. But when we look at psychotic disorders, these are truly serious behavior disorders that result in a loss of contact with reality. These are characterized by having delusions, hallucinations, or even illusions, thinking that something or someone is there when they're really not, having a conversation with that person when they're really not there, having hallucinations that something is coming after you and there's really nothing in the room. Those are considered psychotic disorders, and those are very real and very serious. And you may have students sometime or another in your classroom that do have psychotic disorders. So you need to be aware of that and how to deal with those as you have them in your classroom. A barrier-free facility is a building or structure without architectural obstructions that allows people with mobility disabilities, such as people in a wheelchair, to be able to move freely through the areas, through all the areas. Buildings today have to have elevators with wide doors, at least one elevator set with a wide door, so that a person with a wheelchair could easily move in and out of an elevator. They can't just have a stairway. They have to have an elevator system for people in wheelchairs and people with other handicaps that cannot physically walk up the stairs. And there are all kinds of mobility accommodations that need to be made for people with handicaps. Communities should have the following: a comprehensive, effective plan for placing qualified people in less restrictive settings. And there should also be a waiting list for community-based services that ensures people can receive services and be moved off of the list at a reasonable pace. Okay, in a community, if you have a comprehensive, effective plan for placing people that qualify for services or accommodations so that they can live in a less restrictive environment. In other words, they don't need to be locked away in a nursing home or in an institution just because they are getting older and they can't do certain things for themselves, but they can still take care of themselves for the most part. They can live in a less restricted living condition and just have services to come in and check on them from time to time. One of the services that pops in my mind is Meals on Wheels. And that is the service that people that can no longer cook for themselves, they can be put on a waiting list, and as soon as accommodations can be made, they can then start receiving meals delivered to their home that are already prepared. They are healthy. They're prepared based on their physical condition, the foods that they can have, as opposed to the foods that they're not supposed to have because of their physical condition. So they can they can receive those services that brings them food. There are home health care nurses that can go in periodically and check on people. So communities need to have these services in place to adequately accommodate people rather than just restricting them and locking them away. They are still human beings and they still deserve a chance at the best life possible. Okay, this concludes my lecture over Chapter 1, and I hope this helps to give you a better understanding of what Chapter 1 is all about. It's also a springboard of everything that we're going to get into throughout the rest of this semester. So I hope you enjoy this course, and I hope you enjoy learning all of the different avenues of working with students in these different categories.